Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest, and I live here in Austin, Texas. Had the gift of sobriety since December the 27th of 1972. Very grateful for that and for all the folks who have helped me all along the way. What I thought I'd do is kind of bring you up to date with a project I'm working on. It's a new book on two-way prayer, and we did a video. It is on the website on the subject. I was doing workshops, and especially during the COVID time, I was doing one a month, and we'd get 400 people oftentimes coming to that, and just kind of couldn't keep up with that pace. And so we did a video, had some pretty good feedback on it. So if you're interested in two-way prayer and the process, I'd love you to go to the website, watch the video, download it. Free to share with anybody. Some people have done it at meetings. Some people have done it as little workshops in their 12-step group. But what I decided to do more recently is to do a book on two-way prayer. And so for the last 2 or 3 months, I've been getting into that. And I thought it might be nice to share some of those chapters with you on this little series that we're going to do. And so I'm not going to read them, but I would like to go through some of the highlights of 2 or 3 of the chapters. And I'm going to focus particularly on the quotes that are going to be contained in the book, and you can receive them. I'm going to try to put a link to them in the show notes to this episode and any others that we do, or you can write me at TwoWayPrayer@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send the quotes to you. The first chapter of the book is going to be my story. We always tell, what it was like, what happened, what it's like now. And telling your own story, I think, is important. But I've kind of done that in some different places. I'm really not so interested in doing that now. It is going to be in the newsletter. So if you are interested in my story, get the newsletter and you'll link to it there. Here I want to start with chapter 2, which I'm titling Our Story. And that's going to be a brief review of our history with the Oxford group, not so much going into a detailed history, but focused more on what was the role, what was the place of two-way prayer within the Oxford group. And then we'll look at how the Oxford group was practiced in early AA and how it got lost. So in tackling that, I want to do the historical piece for 3 reasons. And first is I want you to know that two-way prayer isn't some new invention. It's not something coming out of California. It was a core part of our original recovery program, and somehow it got lost. And then the second thing is, I've heard directly from a lot of people over the last several years, people in different 12-step fellowships, telling me how important this practice has been to them, how it has really changed their program, changed their lives, put a lot of zing back in recovery. And that's a really important reason for doing this. And the final one is that recovery rates seem to have been much higher back in the early days when the focus was on prayer and meditation and not just simply on going to meetings. And one of the quotes I'm really fond of comes from Bill Wilson himself, where he said this: "I sort of always felt that something was lost from AA when we stopped emphasizing the morning meditation." And that was my experience. At 20 years sober, I found this thing that really dug into the history and discovered that two-way prayer was really at the heart of the transformation process. So just a quick review. This is another quote from Wilson. And he was saying here, where did he get steps 2 through 11? He said, where did we learn about moral inventory, amends for harm done, turning our will and our lives over to God? Where did we learn about meditation and prayer and all the rest of it? The spiritual substance of our remaining 10 steps came straight from Dr. Bob's and my own early association with the Oxford group. So Wilson was a member of the Oxford group for about 4 years, 4 or 5 years before the big book comes out. Dr. Bob was in it for about 7 years. He was attending for a couple of years before Wilson even showed up in Akron. So a quickie on the Oxford group, started by a man by the name of Frank Bookman, and we can all be very grateful that Bookman's spiritual transformation came about as a result of a resentment. So any of you guys out there harboring or fanning your resentments, hang on, there's hope. But what he learned was really important. What he learned that was the hatred that was in his heart was driving out love. In other words, he couldn't be connected to God and continue hating at the same time. One had to give way to the other. So he surrenders, has a conversion experience. I'm going to talk about that in the book, and recognizes that while he was so angry with these 6 guys on his board of directors, there was something wrong with him too. And he owned that. And he said, I was the 7th wrong man. So he learned a primary lesson for 12-step recovery, that we have to take responsibility for ourselves, that we're not the victims, that if we will own our share of the problem, and we usually do have a share in it, that's usually when the change starts coming about. So he undergoes a spiritual conversion, and I'm really going to dig into what is that all about. Got a whole chapter on what is a psychic change, what's a conversion experience, because it's kind of murky, and I think people need to get a real clear handle on what it is that we're talking about there. Better yet, what the book is talking about when it says it. So anyway, Bookman has this change. He undergoes a transformation, feels the presence of God, just like Wilson felt it when he was in the hospital and called out to whomever or whatever is out there in the universe, I need help, desperation. He changes, feels God's presence, is kind of a new man. And that's an important part of the transformation, the psychic change problem. The very next day, he meets a guy. He's at a conference of some sort in England, and he tells him his story. And the guy says, I got people like that in my life. And that man underwent a psychic change, a conversion experience as well. So he writes a letter of amends to those guys. And through Bookman's life, we're starting to see the beginnings of the 12-step process. He figured, if I can change one guy, why can't I change more? And he begins a series of experiments. And I really encourage people, that's the way one should approach the 12-step journey, because that's the way it was originally presented. Try this experiment. These are not holy, sacred steps that we kneel down and worship. They're an experiment that we need to take into the laboratory of our own lives and see if they work. And so that's what he began doing. He saw that the changes that could happen in people were quick, they were profound, they were dramatic, and it was a shift in consciousness, a psychic change, a spiritual experience that brought about the transformation. They went by many names. He liked to refer to his group as life changers, soul surgeons. Man, if you had a problem, they were out to convert you and change you and get you turned in the right direction. So you can see the steps developing through Bookman's life, that there was a necessity to surrender, to align one's will with God's will. Wasn't focused heavily on theology. There was a confession to another person, telling that person what was wrong with you, and that brought added relief. So that was a nice element. We'll throw that in the mix. He stumbled onto the 4 absolutes as kind of a way to stay connected, test whether you're doing God's will or not, and took that from somebody else. So those were honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. They would test their thoughts by them. test their actions by them. Dr. Bob thought they were wonderful. Bill, not quite so much, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. Making amends was important. Write letters of amends, go see people, admit you're wrong in the deal. Prayer and meditation, absolutely critical. And that's a piece that we've lost. And then that's what the two-way prayer is all about, a form of prayer and meditation that I think really works for people who, especially those of us who have difficulty with prayer and meditation, you know? And then, of course, step 12, sharing it with others. So this one thing that he borrowed, he didn't invent it. It's called two-way prayer. He got a lot of it from different sources. One of the main sources was a professor at Yale University. His name was Henry Wright. And Wright wrote a book, and the book was titled The Will of God and a Man's Life Work. Let me read a quote from Garth Lean. And Garth Lean was Frank Bookman's biographer, his official biographer, let's say. And he wrote this: "The central theme of Wright's book was that an individual could, through two-way prayer, listening for guidance as well as talking, find God's will for his life and for the ordinary events of the day. Wright himself set aside half an hour for such listening prayer first thing every morning. At such times, and indeed at any time in the day, he declared that what he called luminous thoughts came to him from God, provided only that the human receiver was clean enough to pick them up. These thoughts Wright wrote down in a notebook and always tried to carry that out." So I want to just break that down a little bit so that we're, because there's a lot packed into this little paragraph. So the purpose of two-way prayer is that an individual is able to find God's will for his life. Big picture, vocation, where is it that God's leading you? What is it in your life that you are here uniquely to accomplish? Viktor Frankl did a lot of work on the importance of finding meaning and purpose. That if you know your meaning and purpose, depression doesn't seem to come as much. You have a reason for being, a reason for getting up in the morning, you know? But it's very important that you find that. And it doesn't have to be a great big huge thing. It just has to be what it is that you feel and know at a deep, deep part of yourself that you are here to accomplish, you know, as well as for the ordinary events of the day. So it's the big picture. What is God's will for my life? And what is God's will for my day? Because he said you're going to get luminous thoughts. Every thought that comes into your mind when you're doing two-way prayer isn't going to be some, grand appearance from God in your thought life. But some of them are going to just kind of stand out. And you say, where did that one come from? And you'll see this. You'll see it happening. They're unusual thoughts. They're kind of not your everyday kind of, I'm going to make a list sort of thought. And then it's how it's going to come to you. Here's an important line: provided that the human receiver was clean enough to pick them up. So we got to keep this channel between God and ourselves, all right, between the other or the greater self and the lesser self. You've got to keep that line open, clean, and clear. And that's why the four absolutes are important. And we're going to dig into them at some length as well. So if that's clear, and if I'm doing them every day, and that's an important factor as well. If I just kind of blow them off, probably not going to stay in much conscious contact. So, and then we write them down. And then, as he says here, Wright always tried to carry them out. So two-way prayer was part of a morning quiet time. And this was key in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, that period from 1935 through 1939. There was no big book, uh, but prayer and meditation were emphasized. And it wasn't reading somebody else's communication with God. It was establishing your own communication with God and writing that down in your morning guidance quiet time book. So some quotes, and I think I put these in the book because I think it's good to have the people themselves speak to us. It's one thing for me to tell you what they were doing, but let's hear from them in their own words and through 12-step AA published literature that kind of gives you a picture of what was going on there. So this first set of quotes is from Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. It's an AA publication, came out in 1980. So here's Bill Wilson, and he's describing the morning practices that he experienced when he spent 3 months in Akron, Ohio, living with Dr. Bob and his wife, Ann. He later called her the mother of AA. Ann was extremely important in the early days. A lot of people looked to her for understanding of Oxford Group principles, and she was a very loving person. Here's what Wilson describes. He says, each morning there was a devotion. After a long silence in which they awaited inspiration and guidance, Anne would read from the Bible. James was our favorite, he said, the book of James, letter of James. If you don't have a copy of that, write me. I'll be happy to send it to you. I collected some of their favorite writings and put those in a little booklet. So he said James was our favorite. They almost named AA the James Club because there's a lot of the spirituality that is drawn from that book. Reading from her chair in the corner, she would softly conclude, faith without works is dead. And you can see them picking up from that it ain't just that I've got faith. I got to take that faith out into the world, and I've got to start helping people. So works are important as well. Here's Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue, talking about her experiences. And this was going on in her home. She was a young girl at the time. She says, then somebody said a prayer. After that, we were supposed to say one ourselves. Then we'd be quiet. Finally, everybody would share what they got or didn't get. That lasted for at least a half an hour, sometimes went as long as an hour. This is from an AA pioneer named Paul S. He's talking about Dr. Bob and what his morning meditation was like. He said, Dr. Bob's morning devotion consisted of a short prayer, a 20-minute study of a familiar verse from the Bible, and a quiet period of waiting for directions as to where he that day should find use for his talent. Having heard, he would vigorously go about his father's business, as he put it. So Dr. Bob was very much focused on in his quiet time writings, what is my guidance for this day? Looking at the 24 hours ahead. Is there somebody I should call? Is there something God is asking me to do? Is there something left undone from yesterday? Is there something that's getting in the way of my relationship with God, with somebody else in my family or at work, or with myself? What's wrong? To use Star Wars language, is there a disturbance in the force? And if there is, it'll come to you. And then you write it down, and then you go about doing it. Faith without works is dead. So here's another passage. It's quoting Bill Wilson on why Akron recovery rates were so much higher than the ones he was achieving in New York City. So Akron's out there. I think it's safe to say that it was more spiritual because Bob was more spiritual. It was more focused on prayer and meditation because Bob was more focused on it. It used the four absolutes much more in its programming. New York, not so. If you go to a meeting in Akron, Ohio, you're still going to see in a number of the meetings the four absolutes listed on the board. Anyway, here's Bill speaking about why were the rates higher in Akron than in New York. He writes, I think there may have been times when we attributed it to their morning hour of meditation. And then Bill adds the quote that I gave you earlier. I always sort of felt that something was lost from AA when we stopped emphasizing the morning meditation. And then the author of Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers continues saying Bill and Lois themselves continued the practice until his death in 1971. An important quote from that book, and I'm quoting right now specifically from Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, was a study that was done by a man by the name of Frank Amos. Amos went to Akron and interviewed lots and lots of people. Bill Wilson was trying to get money from Rockefeller. Amos worked for Rockefeller, and that Rockefeller's the guy who sent him. And he wanted to understand why was this new group of drunks, they didn't have the name AA yet, because this is before the big book even comes out. What was it about their approach that was working? So he writes this report, and this is significant. He says, this is Amos speaking, of the 110 members then in the program, 70 were in the Akron, Cleveland area. And he reports that in many respects, their meetings have taken on the form of meetings described in the gospel of the early Christians during the first century. And it was very important to me that when I first started digging into the history, that before it was even known as the Oxford Group, it was known as a first century Christian fellowship. What they were trying to do was get beyond the theology, get beyond the doctrine and the dogmas, to a felt experience of God in their lives. Because that's what happened in the first century. I mean, people were feeling the presence of God through the risen Christ. I think Richard Rohr gets this. A lot of theologians really don't, but Rohr has a way of kind of cutting to the chase. What is the essence of what really goes on in writing our relationship with God? So it says the AA members of that time did not consider meetings necessary to maintain sobriety. They were simply desirable. Morning devotion and quiet time, however, were musts. I remember when I first read that 30 some odd years ago, and I'd been raised on meetings. Something was wrong, go to a meeting. But that wasn't what they were raised on. They were raised on meetings are helpful, nothing wrong with them. But more important than meetings was the morning devotion and the quiet time. I looked at that and I said, oh my God, that's not the AA I knew. And it isn't. It isn't. And we're reading somebody else's meditations, if we're reading them at all, the 24-hour book. Well, where did that come from? I was raised on the 24-hour book. If you're really a gung-ho 12-stepper, you would read the 24-hour book in the morning, and the meditations in there. They were very nice. I totally missed that they were the TwoWayPrayer writings of a couple of women in England, that they had taken those writings and put them, edited them a little bit, and put them into a book, one for every day. Well, why the hell am I reading somebody else's writings? I should be writing my own. God had something to say to those two women in England. It was very encouraging, very helpful. But God has something to say to me. God has something to say to you. So stop buying all those books and start writing your own. So here's a second publication. It's called Pass It On, kind of a history of AA. I encourage you to go out and get that one as well if you don't have it already. That one came out in 1984. A few samples from mostly Wilson in this one. So he says, little was heard of theology, but we heard plenty of absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love, the four principles of the Oxford group. Confession, restitution, and direct guidance of God underlined every conversation. They were talking about morality and spirituality, about God-centeredness versus self-centeredness. See, when the book talks about our problem was self, our problem was selfishness, it's talking about being stuck in an ego confining container, that keeps us from being related to the divine, to the other. One expression I found in an Oxford group literature, the beyond that is within. Big Book says what? The great reality is within. Goes on to say they were most ardent in their practice of prayer and meditation, at least an hour. Felt that when they commenced to adhere to the principles, the four absolutes, then every individual could receive specific guidance, which could inspire every decision, every act of living, great or small. Pencil in hand, they wrote down what came into their minds. One could do this alone, with one's family, or in the company of like-minded groups, which they called a team. Such a way of life was urged upon all comers. Do you want to say just a word about two-way prayer groups? I get requests from people all the time, give me a two-way prayer meeting. I know they're out there, I know they've started up, but I want you to pay attention that they started as small teams, a group of committed people who really got together themselves once a week to share their two-way prayer writings, to perhaps listen together. But there was that element of intimacy. And I think that's extremely important. In the beginning, that's what the Oxford group was. It was small groups of individuals, kind of like house churches back in the first century Christianity days, where people got to know one another and share intimately and deeply with one another, And if it's a two-way prayer meeting with 150 people or something like that, yes, you can kind of maybe hear the process going on, but that I don't think that's what it's meant to be. If you want to start a group, write to me. I'll send you some guidance, some experiences that I've had in starting small groups. And I emphasize the word small and kind of keep them small. And then when it gets bigger, split it off, so that it doesn't become institutionalized and mechanized, because that can be the death of a group. Bill Wilson, when he wrote the 12 steps that are so important to all of us, he writes, or this is written about him, as he started to write, he asked for guidance and he relaxed. The words began tumbling out with astonishing speed. He completed the first draft in about half an hour, then kept on writing until he felt he should stop and review what he had written. Numbering the new steps, he found that they added up to 12, a symbolic number. Thought of the 12 apostles, soon became convinced that the society should have 12 steps. And so I'm kind of left with a couple of questions that we're going to get into in the next episode. And that's since two-way prayer was so central to the members of the Oxford group and to the pioneer members of AA, why isn't it really referenced very specifically in the Big Book? Why is there no language, no instructions for how to do that? Why is there nothing about writing? Because that was a critical part of the process. And why isn't this prayer practice still a part of our 12-step programs? So those were the questions as I read more and more Oxford Group books and even got into AA literature where it was referenced as being so very vital, so very important. Why did it get lost? So got a chapter on that, and that'll be the next thing that we will dive into, because I don't think it got totally lost. Let me jump ahead a little bit here. I don't think it got totally lost. I think if you understand two-way prayer, and if you're practicing two-way prayer, then you go back and you start looking at some of the lines in the big book. You're going to see two-way prayer being described. Not exactly, but you're going to understand some of the nuances. Wilson didn't want to address it very specifically as a part of Oxford Group practice, and we'll get into the reasons for that. But he couldn't avoid the intimacy, the guidance, the direction. We will have a new employer. He's the director, we're the agents. All of those things are referring to a change in relationship that is absolutely critical to the two-way prayer process and to approaching steps, basically steps 10, 11, and 12. And if you'll do 10, 11, and 12 every day, watching yourself, watching where you're in need of change, continued through, and then continued the prayer practice, and then act in 12. You get a flow of life that is really, really rewarding and not mechanical in its operation. So I hope this was helpful in getting you to take another look at two-way prayer if you're already doing it. Love to hear from you. Part of the book is going to have samples of two-way prayer writings from people, just like the big book has samples of people telling their stories. If it was just instructions and no stories, you wouldn't get to see the change. So same thing here. And if you're interested in doing that, if you're doing the practice, shoot me a note and I'll send you a little set of instructions that I've developed. I'm going to kind of collect as many of those as I can and then include that in the book as kind of a living example of how people are using the process. So anyway, hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back. We'll do a couple of more sessions on this and give you a taste of what's going to be in the book. Thanks so much. God bless.